We've emerged from 4.5 decades of conflict. People lost Iraq now in the last couple of years, but the emergence from conflict or relative stability has been taking place ever since the end of the Daesh conflict, which is basically late 2018, early 2018 from 2019. Those who have been in Bahrain 2019 and those who've maybe read my work from then, I did a big travel report then, and the idea was an economy that's under transformation. Basically, what we don't realize, and it's very hard for people unless you go and see, is what is the cumulative positive effects of relative stability. In Iraq, you'd say right now, I'm saying to you, 2019. So keep in mind, we had COVID in 2020 and all the other bits and pieces. People say, what, that's relative stability? For Iraq, it is absolute relative stability.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Majlis in Markets. As always, I'm your host, Hassan Jivraj. I don't know what episode we've made it to, but we've come very far since November 2023. And please, before we start this podcast, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and also leave us a rating wherever you're listening or watching this podcast. But now I'd like to introduce my guest for today's episode, Ahmed Tabaqchali. Sayyid Ahmed, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Ahmed, it's really great. It's really great having you on the podcast. You know, I reached out to you for the first time in October 2021, or maybe even before that, for an article I was writing
about. Long?
Yeah, yes, it was. I was actually writing a piece when I was working at an EM debt startup about Iraq's debt situation, and you know, I read some research that you did. And obviously, and then I found out about your background and everything, and how much you've been writing about the Iraqi economy for over decades, and you've been writing about the Iraqi financial sector and all the different things happening in Iraq and in other areas as well. Before we'll get on to what you're doing in your professional. But Ahmed, could you give our listeners and viewers your background story?
Okay. Well, this thing is sadly you only have an hour for the whole thing and asking questions. Otherwise, I could talk for hours about my background. But in a nutshell, basically, I'm an Iraqi. I am a son of a career diplomat. So I spent most of my life living and studying almost all over the world. I came to Iraq not versus a normal way. I left Iraq as a teenager in the 70s, went to Algiers, got my baccalaureate there, went to the UK, did some A-levels, went to New Zealand, graduated and mathematics stuff, came back to the UK, graduated, finished a master's degree in mathematics. And since then, I've been working in financial markets, mostly in London, and exclusively in London, working for US financial firms or US brokerage houses that sell US equities to European investors. So I was mostly what's called an institutional salesperson, specializing in US equities. That was my background. Over the years, as everybody sort of gets aware of other markets and other developments, you end up by looking at other areas. And in time, I don't know how long, so let's say early 2000s, I started looking at the Middle East, and I spent a time in Dubai, and I was in 2000 and was it 2? I think, 2000 and 2003, I was hired by a major Kuwaiti bank to head their brokerage operations. And so I was, moved in the Middle East almost on a full-time basis. I had a short stint for a couple of years in Dubai, 2005 and 2006. Basically, what I did, I worked on creating ETFs, trying to make the markets more, at the time, they were far less accessible than they are today. And I was working on ETFs and index creation and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, long story short, 2008 to Kuwait, I was head of the brokerage for one of the major banks there. And in time, the bank had an operation in Iraq. They bought a majority stake in an Iraqi bank. And I was invited to sit on the board of that bank in 2012. And sort of gradually, I got reintroduced to Iraq. And in 2013, 2014, when Iraqi equity markets were opening up to the whole world, I thought was a fascinating opportunity in the sense that it reminded me of comparisons are always, one should always treat them with caution because every country's dynamics, size, and so is different. But it reminded me very much so of the same time, the opening of India in the 1990s or emerging markets and so forth. And this was one emerging market that I knew a lot about because one, I'm a native, but also I do understand the equation. My my perceived value add was that I could fit in both cultures fairly easily. And that's really where I end up by leaving the bank. I worked with them on IPO for one of the major telecom operators. And that's when I got in touch with my current partners at AFC Capital. At the time, they were already investing in Iraq, and we met in a conference in Erbil 13, and we seemed to have a lot in common. And so when ISIS, or Daesh, I'd say more likely, invaded Mosul, and that we thought, I at least told myself, that was a perfect time to re-entry. because basically that was when fear was extreme. Everybody thought Iraq was coming to an end and all that kind of stuff. And then we looked at it and said, well, that's really what the opportunity is. Because the essence of what we do, or the essence of actually the way I look at investing in Iraq in a way, is there's always a delta. There's always a difference between real and perceived risk. As you know, given the nature of the information flow on the country, it's fairly terrible. Even up to now, it's fairly terrible. And there's a gap between perceived and real risk. And asset prices tend to be priced at perceived risk, not the real risk. And for us, it was actually arbitraging the delta between this disparity between risks. So as risk perceptions improve towards real risk, asset prices move up. It doesn't remove the risk for Iraq story. It doesn't mean Iraq has to be a perfect environment where everything goes right. But that was where the risk, and that's where the genesis behind the launch of the AFC Iraq Fund is. And so, you know, my background, while I left Iraq as a teenager, I returned as, I don't know, somebody in their late 50s, early 60s back again. And I started teaching at the American University of Iraq and do other kind of teaching and getting more and more involved in the country, and which helps me in how I look at the fund and investments in Iraq.
Ahmed, this is a really great background you've had, and I think you're really well placed to talk about what's happening in Iraq and the economy over there. I think Iraq is not very well covered by a lot of the mainstream media. I know the current prime minister, he gave an interview a couple of weeks ago to CNBC. And, Iraq is a very interesting country. Why should people care about Iraq, would you say, to begin with?
Well, I mean, it depends, what their interest is or how they understand the country. You're right in one sense. I mean, the perception or the coverage of Iraq has improved, by the way, tremendously since, let's say, 10 years ago when we launched the fund. I mean, most of the time, the great reporting or the great writing was mostly done by the World Bank and the IMF, but nobody reads these things because they tend to be sort of somewhat dry. But their data was there. In terms of media coverage, it's always been terrible. Very poor understanding. I mean, we mentioned earlier about dollar and so on. There's always a very poor understanding of how Iraq is and what it is. Hasn't changed much. Why should people interested? It depends. I mean, Iraq, if you look at it, Iraq is a country of 46 plus million people, growing at 2.3%, most like sub-Saharan African growth rates than the Middle East. So we're a very fast-growing country. We're a very young population. The country has been pretty much in isolation for the past 4.5 decades or thereabouts, or conflict. I mean, we had a brutal 8-year war with our neighbor, followed by the invasion of Kuwait, followed by horrendous sanctions, followed by an American invasion, an insurgency that became civil war. And when we started to breathe in 2009 and so forth, we had Daesh a few years later. And the country was almost torn apart. And so what basically saying is you have the infrastructure of the country completely destroyed over these years. Yes, we've rebuilt a lot. I mean, we're rebuilding in the last few years, but we're talking of decades worth of rebuilding what is needed. A consumer society where there is enormous amount of money in the economy, young consumers. So you're looking basically what? The peace dividend. That by itself is a big thing. You have the demographic dividend, i.e. we're growing young population. And if anybody who invested in the US markets in the last, 15 and 20 years, you know the phrase baby boomers, right? That's when Iraq is a prime baby boomer. Thirdly, is transformation of an economy. We're moving away from a cash-based economy into a banking-based economy. So you're looking at three major sort of multi-decade moves in a country. So if you are, let's say, doing business in Iraq or exporting anything to Iraq, I mean, why won't you look at a country of 46.5 million people with enormous resources that is rebuilding? If you're investing, why shouldn't you look at that as a sort of diversification away from other markets? But if you don't want to look, I mean, the world is your oyster. You can look elsewhere.
On some of the previous episodes, we've spoken to venture capitalists, and I didn't know until I wrote an article in 2022 there was actually a venture capital scene in Iraq, and we've had some guests on who have done startups, and people can go and I'll link that in the show notes. But Ahmed, before our conversation today, I was reading an article or a report from the IMF, and among other research I was doing, and it kind of wasn't that positive, the IMF. I mean, they said some good stuff, and they weren't that positive, particularly on Iraq's non-oil economy growth prospects. I mean, you've written a lot about this. Like I mentioned just now, I was listening to the presentation you gave at the LSE a few months ago when you were presenting your paper. At this point in time, obviously, we've got to remember that today is the day of the Iraqi elections. So when this podcast does come out, we'll know the results.
The sixth one we have. The sixth one since 2003. So far, we've had peaceful transfer of power. It's a minor victory, by the way, but thing for the Middle East is quite nice to have.
Yeah,
but doesn't alter the picture. Go on.
absolutely. Yeah. And the question I had to you, Ahmed, if right now, if we're speaking right now, how would you currently characterize Iraq's economy? Do you think it's stabilizing or do you think it's stagnating?
On the contrary, it's more than stabilizing. But basically, look at it this way. As I mentioned to you earlier, that we've emerged from 4.5 decades of conflict. People notice Iraq now in the last couple of years, but the emergence from conflict or relative stability has been taking place ever since the end of the Daesh conflict, which is basically late 2018, early 2018 from 2019. Those who have been in Bahrain 2019 and those who've maybe read my work from then, I did a big travel report then, and the idea was an economy that's under transformation. But basically what we don't realize, and it's very hard for people unless you go and see, is what is the cumulative positive effects of relative stability. I mean, Iraq, you'd say right now, I'm saying to you, 2019. So keep in mind, we had COVID in 2020 and all the other bits and pieces. People say, what, that's relative stability? For Iraq, it is absolute relative stability. Has, been in a state of conflict forever. So from 2019 onwards, we've had a relative stability. And the cumulative positive effects of that are really hard to quantify until you see, but you can see them now. Because look, when you can things better, i.e. better and better and better, when things are stable, bits and pieces add up. So people begin to venture out, for example. Like when I first came back in Baghdad in 2017, people don't go out much at night. They invite you to their homes. You don't ride any cab unless you're really comfortable with them. You don't go out. Now you go out in Baghdad and it's like 12 o'clock at night. People are still just beginning to go to restaurants, and restaurants don't close until 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning. And life is full. But with that, you get construction activity. People begin to build roads. I mean, Baghdad is undergoing a transformation. The last time we've seen was in the 80s. So you have those taking place, which are all positive, but they built on. What you have is what self-reinforcing positive cycle, which is the reverse of what we had. So every time you do something good, you build upon it and it builds up. That's why I always call it the positive cumulative effects of relative stability. It's not one effect, it's a building on process. The other one, which is fairly major, and its relations to what I talked about at the LSE, was the banking transformation. So basically, everybody looks at dollar flows and stuff like that, and you hear all kinds of talks and conspiracy theories about money smuggling, dollar smuggling, all the usual stuff that makes the Wild West pretty mild in comparison to what you hear. But basically, the underlying of all of what we had is, look, as a country right now, we don't export anything. We almost export. The only thing we export is oil. We import almost everything. So basically, the source of foreign currency is in dollars, and it's only via government, basically oil sales. While demand for private goods and so is from the private sector, which is mostly informal. So the question is, how does the informal sector access formal dollars through the auction? And that's when you had the compromise that complicated it. People came up with all kinds of stuff. A lot of them on the surface were correct, i.e. fake invoices and so forth, but they were in nature of how the Hawala system functioned in Iraq. The 2022 changes changed all of that. So what it meant is that we started moving to transfer currency exactly like every other country does in the world. And people don't realize it, but let me give you some data, because the thing is, I'm one of few people who is most data-driven as opposed to opinion. In my mind, as years of working in financial markets, I've learned almost in every subject, people can talk, and there's always an opinion. Financial markets, your opinion doesn't matter. It's the results that matter. Data what matters more than anything else.
Numbers don't lie.
In a way, yeah. I mean, numbers can lie if you don't understand them. That's where the thing is, yeah. But numbers are pure numbers. So if you look at the transfers done to the central bank, right, in 2023, which is the first full year after the imposition of the changes that we've had in November 22, we've had, through correspondent banking relationships, and I mean real correspondent bankers, so you're talking banks like JP Morgan, like Citicorp, the major US banks, 2.6, so let's round the figures, $23 billion out of $56 billion went through that system. So you're talking something like 40.5%. The following year, because, it takes evolution, things don't happen in one day. So in 2024, we've had $58 billion went through corresponding system out of an 81 billion. So you're talking something like 72%. Year to date, as of the end of July, we have something like 43 billion out of 48 billion went through correspondent banking. So that's 89%. So not only is our volume of trade growing because we have higher transparency, because the figures year to date in July show you are showing something like 9%. If they carry on till year end, we have a 9% year-over-year growth, which is phenomenal. So you go in from 40% goes into correspondent banking, into 72%, into 89%, which means we're evolving and becoming very much like every other country. That talks to you about stabilization, with the currency and all that kind of stuff. So we are moving the right way. So coming back to your question earlier is, where are we at? So we have that transformation driving the economy. We have that one there. So basically our economy is going in massive transformation. However, and that's really where, when you mentioned the IMF, by the way, which by the way is absolutely correct, we are still oil dependent. So we're still subject to oil prices, and our leverage to oil that comes into from government revenues, and the government by itself, by the way, so I mentioned to you, almost all our exports are oil, which means that drives our government revenues, and the government is the biggest player in the economy. So as a result, we end up by cyclically being highly affected by oil prices. So it's almost like, you get positives when oil prices are up, because our system is still a rentier state economy, which is really where the IMF criticism and that is. We end up by being pro-cyclical. So when times are good, the government's actions actually make it super good. When times are bad, they make it super bad, because when there's plenty of money, you spend it. When there's no money, you don't spend. So that they're right. However, what I see is a secular transformation that I mentioned to you earlier, relative stability, all of that, that will, to use Trump in a phrase, trump these things. So the negative effect of oil prices will either magnify or dampen. I think at this stage right now, they're dampening the effects of the transformation. I haven't seen evidence yet where that is cancelled or cancels it. Because even in this year, a year where you have, we're supposedly looking at the IMF figures, we're supposed to have a slowdown this year. So far, it says showing 9% year-over-year growth. That's not consistent with the slowdown. Obviously, I don't have whether it's imports or export, the details of them. So it's too early to tell, but at least one evidence tells you, no, there isn't much of a slowdown yet. So it hasn't really acted as a damper. But do I expect it to act as a damper? Has to be, absolutely. Nothing goes up in a straight line. We've had 2 gangbuster years of growth in the economy. We had 2 gangbuster years in the stock market. Nothing is smooth. I mean, as anybody who watches financial markets, when they tell you something goes straight up, you say, well, show me something at last it's staying up. But is the trend up? The trend is up. That's what I'm clear about.
Very good. Ahmed, to any economy, whether it's frontier, developed or emerging, robust banking sector is important for financial intermediation and other financing activities and stuff. The Iraqi banking sector is an interesting one, because I think like a lot of the problems do date back decades. And given the size of the population you've mentioned, and the number of projects that are coming and the projects that need financing, if we get into it, what do you think the real bottlenecks are within Iraq's banking sector?
Well, look, I mean, almost everybody looks at the banks and say, what is wrong with the banking sector? That's always, I mean, forgive me for saying this phrase, but anybody who watched, well, that's when I'm going to show my age. The President Clinton's first run for presidency. If you remember, the phrase that he used all the time against Bush Sr. was, it's the economy, stupid, right? And I think that's where almost everybody misses that. Yes, there are issues with our banks, but it's not so much the banks as the system that they live in. We are, because of the conflict, because of the years of authoritarian rule and so forth, we are a cash-based economy. Nobody trusts the banking system. Nobody trusts anything other than cash in your hand. So you have that is there, and you have an informal sector. The informal sector, we've always had an informal sector. Our informal sector grew substantially during the sanctions years, because that's how we managed to interact with the outside world through smuggling but our economy was mostly informal. So where do the banks fit in that? They don't fit in that. And so therefore, whatever you have, we've always had some great banks. We had most of the major regional banks bought banks in Iraq. They worked over the years upgrading their systems and so forth. But in an economy like that, where there's normal banking growth, if people don't put their money in the banking system, where has the bank got with the wherewithal to begin to lend? If people don't use the banking for payments, how can the banks work? So in an environment like that, you have many banks rose that are purely temporary, let's say, in nature, because they don't really work in a proper banking sector. Most of them worked as sort of, I would say, extensions of an informal system. So Hawalas, as you must be aware of, it's a system that actually that connected the Middle East to India and to the whole, like the whole India and everywhere around it. Hawala goes for hundreds of years. Hawala, is very informal. I give you money, someone here, somebody else gives you money there instantly. That dominated the economy. The thing is with Hawala and stuff like that, people always associated with money laundering and so forth. The question is, yes, there are risks in that, but it's informal. So when money doesn't transfer, you don't apply all the regulations on know your client and know your stuff. So there is room for things to be wrong. Whether they're wrong, that's subject to the imagination, because you get sort of most Western analysts who go and freak out about something like that. But generally, Middle East, and you know very well, most trade happens by trust. I trust you and trust me. Obviously, that doesn't really work in the modern system, where we need to make no source of funds. We need to do all that kind of stuff where we can close the abuses. So our system was mostly informal, and we're moving towards formality. It takes a time. It's accelerating. If you look at the volume of transactions taking place in e-wallets and credit cards and debit cards, it's massive. I mean, we're growing like wheat. But having said that, it's from a very low base. So it takes time for that to become all there, for intermediations, for lending to happen, for all that kind of stuff. But are we, let's say, shedding the compromise that we had in our systems? Yes, we are shedding those. We're going away. As I gave you the figures earlier, if you look at transfers, I gave you the figures. Now, 89% of them go through formal, really formal. So you're going through all the normal KYCs, all the clearances, all the clearance. That shows you it's development. But this kind of development does not get measured in years. It takes decades. I mean, not decades, I would say, but let's say the move from informality. Iraq, what people don't see is Iraq has been a massive move towards formality over the last couple of years. But as I said, it takes forever for an informal structure to really become formal. You get shares and percent. I mean, informality works, but it's a mess compared to the neatness of formality.
Yeah, Ahmed, I was just telling you offline, I returned from Bahrain a few days ago, where I was attending the AOFI conference. People who know about AOFI and Islamic finance. As we're an Islamic finance focused podcast, do you think that also the lack of public interest, you've talked about the banks and how they need to improve, and it dates back a long time. But do you think there's also like a religious angle here, in the sense that people don't trust interest-based system, or do you think it's a bit more practical?
Honestly, I don't think that is the case. Look, if we go towards the way we're going, we have some top banks in the country, by the way. They're few, but they're growing. The system is growing. The central bank is working on a massive transformation of the banking sector. But the trust is not so much religious and stuff. I mean, I think end of the day, I'm not an expert on Islamic finance, but whatever the tools we have, they end up by mimicking each other. So whether it's interest or sharing of profits, if you look at the percentage return, they're roughly comparable. And I think most people would look at those things. So yes, I think the Islamic angle is important, but I don't think that's the obstacle.
Would you also say
more really is the structure of the economy itself? That's the real obstacle.
Yeah, I was going to say it's more practical. But the other thing that's interesting, Ahmed, I was reading an article a few months ago, and it was quite to my surprise that Iraqis love buying gold as well. Like if you take the Indians or the Turks or other cultures, Iraqis also buy a lot of gold on a personal basis. Do you think they've also been putting their money into things like that?
Well, that doesn't surprise me. But otherwise, also keep in mind, this is one of the few manifestations of a cash-based economy. You either put your money in dollars and you put them in a mattress, or you put them in gold. I mean, it's always been the case. My parents, my father was a career diplomat, and he spent, I think, something like 8 years or thereabouts in Southeast Asia. And gold is a big factor. So as an Iraqi, it wasn't strange to me to see the dominance of gold. But I think in time, as the economy and people get more sophisticated with financial instruments, physical gold itself will have less of an asset. You'll have more gold ETFs, maybe more gold-linked equities or gold link, whatever it is, as opposed to physical gold. But that's the nature of an informal society where there is no confidence in a financial system. You end up by holding physical assets. What are physical assets? You either have a choice of immovable physical asset like property, or you have movable ones like gold and dollar note and so forth.
There was a really good piece in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago talking about and they've been reporting on this for the past couple of years, is that the US was obviously worried about Iranian influence within the Iraqi banking sector. And Iraqi banks have complained, and I've talked to people as well within Iraq and outside who have bank accounts. They do complain that the lack of dollars within the banking sector. Do you think like the impact of the US or the influence of the US is stifling Iraq's development with regards to its banking sector?
I honestly think all these talks of lack of dollars and so forth, mostly, I don't know, when I read them, all of these things, they start with thorough investigations of going something on a few $1 million and they somehow say, oh, because I've managed to unearth this and this and this on a few $1,000,000, that applies to, a multiple $1 billion economy or multiple billion transfers. There's never been a shortage of dollars in Iraq. What there has been a shortage of, Iraq is, by the way, you got to keep in mind, like many other countries over the years, the dollarization is everywhere. So if you look at our financial system, I don't have the figures in my head, so don't fully quote me, but I'm going from memory. Something like, I think, 30 to 35% of all deposits in the banking sector are in dollars. So how big is the actual cash dollars in the economy? There are no figures of that. But imagine at least 30 to 50% of the currency in circulation is dollars. So there's always access to dollars. We've always had dollars. I mean, when I first came to Baghdad, when you change dollars, a taxi driver changes dollars. I'm not a taxi driver, but like you go to almost everywhere, you can change dollars. It's not that difficult. Dollars are available. But what happened during that time, as I mentioned to you, the issue really was in 2022 when the regulations changed, i.e. we became very much like every other country. Access to formal dollars became very hard with the closure of the hawala or with the massive diminishing of the hawala system. So basically, almost all the informal businesses and all the formal businesses which accessed formal dollars, but through the hawalas, that door was mostly closed. So what they ended up with, accessing it through the parallel market. The parallel market for years and years, during periods of stability, was something like 2% premium to the official price, which within what's the IMF definition of a unified exchange rate, 2% is acceptable, is okay. But when that happened, that shot to the 20%. That's where you had the talk of no availability of dollars, because the informal sector could no longer access formal dollars through the mechanism. The percentage between the formal and informal now is about 10%, down from high 20s, which tells you, by the way, that there is more people accessing the formal sector. And that's what I said to you. We have increased formality, but we still are 10%, which means, and I don't think it will close in any day. It'll take time for those who are seeking dollars through the informal sector to become formal. But real shortage of dollars? No, there's never been real shortages of dollars. Informally, you can't access them, but people mix as well cash dollars versus digital dollars. If it's me and you, by the way, and we are merchants, or what we call in Iraq, Tujjar Junta, or the suitcase merchants, you go with a suitcase full of dollars, you go and buy stuff and come back. Physical dollars might be an issue for them. But if you're importing a few hundred millions of dollars worth of items, you don't do them in cash. You do them through the banking sector. And that, as long as your papers were clear, was always a possibility. And they're just the figures I gave you earlier, and these are just figures, just shows you how much more is going through the formal sector. So formal sector from 40% in the first year of experience into 89%. That runs at the same time as a decline in the difference between the premium, between the official and the unofficial market. So it's not what people say it is. The talk that most of the time about money going to Iran and so forth, I think that's a lot to do with, honestly, with I don't know, as I said to you earlier, conspiracy stories that make the Wild West seem very, very tame. Because, people like, we do, by the way, trade with Iran. People don't realize that. Iran is one of the top 3, exporters to Iraq. And we trade mostly with Iranian sort of merchants. So when we buy tomatoes from Iran, or we buy vegetables and cars, we're not buying them from the regime. So they're not subject to sanctions thereabouts. And, if we're doing $8 to $9 billion worth of trade, you know how people always think that all goes into, back in the back of donkeys or lorries into Iran. $1 billion weighs a ton and fills, one of those huge trailers. So $8 billion, can you imagine $8 billion leaving Iraq, going to Iran? And just think, by the way, of the logistics. You have to count them when they leave, and the $8 billion, if it's received in Iran, got to count them, and then they've got to go outside. Because what will Iran do with dollars? What would you do dollars inside Iran? As an individual, I would keep them under the mat because I don't trust my system. But what do I do with them? I need them to trade with the outside world. So then that $8 billion a year leaves and goes where? China, India, all the places Iran trades with. Really? I think a lot, honestly. I'm not saying that the investigations are wrong. I have no reasons to doubt them, but you can't extrapolate from a few $1 million worth of very iffy transactions into the whole banking sector. People don't do this with the West. I mean, if you follow the Western, and you see, there was almost a year ago or so, as I mentioned it in my thing, TD Bank in the US. People don't know what TD Bank is. TD Bank is a Canadian bank. It's the 10th largest in deposits in the US. It was actually fined by the regulator by a few $billion. If I remember, a few $billion. I don't have the figures in my head, but they were fined because they enabled money laundering for over 10 years by smuggling or whatever it is. Nobody goes in and says, oh my God, 10th biggest bank in the US was involved in this, and everything that bank does is no. I mean, scale. People take a few million in Iraq and they say, oh, it applies to the whole system. But when a few billion happen elsewhere, nobody takes that and goes, oh yeah, the whole Western system is.
Yeah, there's been a lot of controversies.
You know what I mean? There's more of a, when it comes to Iraq, given our ugly history, and I really don't blame people for looking at that. Given how ugly our history is, given how ugly our civil war was, given how ugly many things is, yeah, people find it much easier. And people do, I mean, I've seen a ton of investigations into the dollar. I have no reason to doubt them, by the way. But if you add up, you're talking a few millions, at best tens of millions, at best hundreds of millions. But hundreds of millions of something wrong does not mean 80 billion of something is wrong. It doesn't mean we don't fight the wrong. It doesn't mean we excuse it. Because, you know, any criminal activity when it comes to money, it's not excusable. You know, the reason why we have all these regulations on anti-terrorist financing, anti-money laundering, is to help us. It's not to hinder us, right? So we should fight anything wrong. We can't take that small part and extrapolate to the whole country. Makes no sense. If you do it to every other country.
With
Anyways.
this low public trust and all these inherent challenges within Iraq's banking sector, do you think, I know the government's got a plan or has talked about a plan for fintech and digital payments, and obviously, like I just mentioned to you, I just came back from Bahrain and they have like a fantastic digital payment infrastructure. Do you think Iraq can, introduce its own kind of fintech or digital payments?
Well, look, I think that we need to all step back from the way you use the phrase fintech and adding so much glamour to it. I mentioned to you Hawala. Hawala is the world's first fintech. It's actually, if you look at almost all the developments in fintech, they are still in the Hawala sector, right? In transfers. Look at the latest banking stuff. They're no different than the Hawala. In a sense, payments. So you look at fintech and all that, you look at, first of all, as a payments mechanism. So you have payments mechanism. Our current payment structure is expensive. People don't like the expenses that come with it. Transfer costs are very high. The reason why people remittances still use Hawala and why almost all developments in fintechs are still in transfers, in transfer companies, still in there. So that, I think, that in terms of whether we are progressing in the right track, in terms of if you look at payments, yes, we are. As I said to you, if you look at the growth, and if you've seen my writings in the past, I'm going to have something fairly soon on that. The rise in transfers in terms of the amount of transactions that take place on cards, whether they're digital wallets, i.e. phone wallets and so forth, which are, by the way, are all the rage in Iraq, as well as in cards, they are going in leaps and bounds, but from a very low base. Now, almost everything in Iraq is done there. I mean, one of the things that people don't realize, and, you know, it's quite funny, is, you know, the concept of leapfrog. So you look at some of the most modern things, you know, let's say if you travel to Dubai, you have the e-gate, right? Dubai had e-gates since, I don't know, 2004, 5, 6, something like that. It developed them way ahead of countries like the UK. But if you look at Iraq, we've had e-gate for almost 2 years, which accept digital passports, ahead of many other countries in the Middle East. I mean, I'm talking small things, right? In terms of now a passport in Iraq, which used to take forever to get, now it can be done in a matter of hours digitally. I mean, these are few bright spots. There are plenty of ugly spots. So I'm not going to tell you these things are what defines us, because we've got a long way to go. We've got a long way of legacy systems, legacy mindsets. I mean, to give you something really strange, or really funny in a way, it gives them the mindset. Many Iraqis still trust cash. Still, they think cash is the ultimate. Even though it's expensive, it's complicated, it's subject to risk, but they do not trust money, they still trust cash. But you get more and more, let's say, the government, the one of the few things the government did is right, is use what is wrong with us, which is basically the large size of the public sector, as a way to accelerate things. So, government right now, almost, I think in a few months, almost all government payments have to be in payment systems. And that, coming back to an earlier question, you said intermediation. Intermediation can only work if banks play a big part as a savings vehicle, as also as a payment system. We are still, it's happening, by the way, really happening, but as I said to you, from a very low scale. But as all these things happen, and the question is when, I'm not sure I have the answer, but it's very much like the hockey stick. You have growth, and then you have an explosion. People talk about something like 5-7%. That's when it happened in other cultures. Whereas, I'm, as an investor in Iraq, I'm closely watching that because I think that's fairly important. But Is it happening? Yes. Got to always keep it in mind. When did it happen? How far is happening? You can't compare, by the way, Iraq to places like Bahrain, to places like UAE. These countries have had relative stability for almost, I don't know, 30, 40 years plus. They have clear systems. They've had time to build infrastructure. With us, we have many parts of the infrastructure are not built. So, our problem with electricity hinders our problem with the internet and all that kind of stuff. So for these things to work, you need many multiple parts to move. For us, all the many moving parts, some are in development, some will take massive effort to get them going. So you can't look at one thing without looking at all the stuff. But if you ask me as an investor, somebody who's invested in Iraq personally, as well as in that, I see it going the right way. But do I see it risk-free? Of course not. No such thing exists.
If you think like the likes of like a Revolut or something like that, it's a huge company. But again, like I think you've kind of articulated like why would a big company like fintech company like Revolut or somebody similar go to a place like Iraq when the financial infrastructure is not in place, or the legal infrastructure is still lagging behind other markets, right? Like it's still a high risk market for some of these companies.
Look, I'm a big fan of all these companies, but end of the day, I think people tend to lose sight. I mean, you see rises, price movements in digital currencies, and somehow you think fintech is all going to right. I mean, basically, Revolut, ultimately, what is it? It's a bank, right? It takes deposits, gives loans. If it does that, then it's subject to the same regulations that every other bank is. It's got to protect your money just like every other bank is. It's got to have liquidity ratios just like any other bank. Now, the difference between them and the other banks is they haven't got legacy systems, which means they can easily adopt. But all of these companies, in the beginning of their adoption, if you look at the issues they've all had with their regulators, it was with the lack or weak systems. Because the thing is, which makes people always say regulations, but regulations are a factor of life. So let's say source of funds. Source of funds is a very important concept in the fight against money laundering, in the fight against terrorism. If I come in today to you with a $10 million and deposit it, you don't ask me where that money comes from. I might be very well a clean guy who works in selling, let's say, tomatoes across the whole region. But easily a drug trafficker can have the same thing. Almost all the new banks or whatever it's called, initially, if you look at their problems, it's the infrastructure they had for spotting these kind of transactions. Also, when it comes to transfers, because basically, most of them, by the way, I'm not generalizing, but the few that I've read, they function just like a hawala. Because money doesn't move from one place to another. Because they have two-way traffic all the time, you always build up, let's say, a big asset base, and you also in dollars, and also, let's say, a big dollar asset base in yen. So you can always transfer between the two countries, but money doesn't move. But if you don't ask where the money comes from, like a normal bank has to do, eventually the regulator will come to you and say, and people say, oh, regulations are bad. They're cumbersome. Don't get me wrong, regulations are painful. They're cumbersome. Their whole reason for existence is to protect the consumer, is to protect us from what can go wrong in a financial crash. Look at the guys who've invested, let's say, in something like Luna. Do you remember the Luna coin, which was supposed to be What happened? What happened to the $40 billion worth of people who put money and lost all their life savings? Did they get a penny back? I don't think so. But as a concept, could have worked. So I like all of these things. I'm very keen on them. But for, let's say, what will stop Revolut more than anything else is yet we're still lacking, let's say, in terms of moving from paper to digital. So in Iraq, we still need wet signatures. We don't use e-signatures as such. E-contracts are not there yet. I don't think we have an e-contract law, which means ultimately you still have to have paper-based. We're taking a long time to move into all digital stuff. So, when you open an account with Revolut, the beautiful thing about it, you can do almost everything online. They scan your card, they get your details, they get your permission. Can I check your data from so and so? You say yes. Without that, it's hard for them to offer you the fast service. For Iraq, you don't need look at one. It's a whole thing that goes with it. I mean, just to give an example, recently I updated my UK papers, and it was all online because the passport office has that, someone has that, all of it works together. Why? But that was not available 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Because you need multiple bits to fit into the thing. Iraq, the infrastructure is not there yet.
I was because my next thought was, there's a lot of hype around blockchain and the transparency blockchain offers and tokenization. And obviously in Iraq, we've seen a lot of interest from retail investors into cryptocurrency. I don't think it's still legal. and the regulators haven't embraced it too much. Do you think things like blockchain and tokenization can help Iraq get to this kind of place where you're talking about?
Well, the thing is, look, it's a wonderful technology, right? But you got to take it away from the rise in crypto prices. So when you're talking about buying digital currency, people are not buying them to use them as a means of exchange. Who do you know who uses Bitcoin to pay for services? Nobody uses Bitcoin to pay for services or to pay for goods. Why would I, if I had a Bitcoin, and I don't, and which much should I regret? Because
I think people use it more as an asset than a form of exchange, right? They use it more as an asset than an exchange form of exchange.
So absolutely, we use it as an asset. But as long as the asset prices go up, if they go down, what happens to use of an asset? People get excited with the price of the Bitcoin and think, oh yeah, we're going to use it. Well, the whole idea of Bitcoin, as romantic and wonderful as it seemed at the time, was that you have no control over the currency. So basically, the issuance of the currency is not subject to politicization or a central bank interaction. All very noble ideas, but nobody's using that. Everybody's excited about the move in prices. And a lot of the uses of these things, I don't know, but it makes sense to me, is in terms of money launderings and what have you. Because ultimately, it's like a super efficient hawala. If you think about it, if I actually go and buy a stable coin, let's say in Baghdad, let's say if it's available, I buy it today, and within seconds I sell it in Mexico or sell it in Uganda or anywhere else, the risk of price movement is very minimal against me, so I tend to keep my asset, but instantly I have money there. Nobody checks on where the money came from and so forth. Right? How much of that does take place, I have no idea, but it's there. But I think that's part of the promise of technology offers. Because the issue we have with fund or money transfer is the cost of the transfer. The cost of the transfers are high because of all the checks that have to do in between. But the mechanism of actually converting your money today using stable coins, of let's say, I'm talking dollars, I'm talking, I have a greenback in my hand, I go to a thing, I get a stable coin, I instantly sell a stable coin somewhere else, get a yen somewhere else. That's fast, efficient. We can make use of it, I think, but there is a lot of work to be done. Tokenization, all of these things. The checks on balance. I mean, I when I first read blockchain, I fell in love with it. But also you have the issues of the cost of using that service, the cost of verification of transactions. I mean, we always had this idea that transactions are immutable. Well, we're learning more and more that if there's a large number of people who are doing the verification in a certain close areas, then they can affect the whole blockchain. So, there is, and the cost of it's what? Electricity, the environment. So nothing is cost-free, but the technology itself, the concept is fascinating. And I think it will have a revolution on the way system works.
One other thing I want, yeah. Go ahead.
The only thing I'm saying is Iraq, what can benefit from, people use the phrase leapfrog. I mean, you have the idea of leapfrog. It's only because you have no legacy systems. So as we adopt more and more, same thing with mobile telecom. I think Iraq is similar to India in a sense. Look at, cost of mobile phones and cost of internet in India is one of the lowest in the world, if not the lowest. Partly benefited from lack of infrastructure of fixed lines. Iraq, we have fixed lines, but I haven't seen any house which has a fixed line for years. But we have G and 4G, and it's everywhere. That's kind of a leapfrog.
Yeah. Ahmed, I think a lot of people who are not familiar with Iraq will also be quite surprised, and you're specializing in this as well. You mentioned this on the youth podcast you were talking about a couple of months ago, was Iraq has a stock exchange, a local stock exchange. Why hasn't this scaled, do you think, to where it should be?
I think it's a question of time. Keep in mind, by the way, the stock exchange, we had phenomenal returns. Again, past, let me be quite clear, past performance is no key for future. I think people got to do their homework and stuff. But, for example, our fund, we were up 110% in 23, up 44 point something in 24. And year to date, we have a muted performance. We're up 12% year to date as of the last month. But we're talking from this in a country that's starting on a very, very low base. So the market's still shallow, still illiquid, not that many number of companies, but these things take time. Our regulations are still old and they still discourage movements towards full financial markets. But if you ask me, is it going? Of course it's happening. I remember, my own personal journey, and you mentioned earlier, where did I start? I remember in 2000 and so forth, and realistically, when I really was fascinated by the Middle East, I was fascinated when you had a wave of IPOs, which happened in 2003, 2005. One of them was a company people don't know many more about. And I'm not going to do political advertising for them, but as a person, as somebody who was in Western financial markets, a company called Hikma Pharmaceuticals. It's one of the generic pharmaceutical companies. When I looked at that company, and I was stunned that an Arabic company, a Middle East company, with that kind of stuff existed. which made me look into financial markets in the Middle East. And that's how I came and went to, for example, in Dubai, and I worked on ETFs. At that time, indices were not reflective of the stock exchange because, for to have an ETF, you need to have an index that can be replicable. So if you look at the evolution, even of the S&P 500 and so forth, it's an index that's replicable, i.e. somebody can recreate it. That was non-starter in the days when we started. And the first ETF we tried to launch, and I worked out on an index. We called it Falcon Index. It was called Following All Arabic Liquid Companies. And the idea, we tried to work with creating an index that can be replicated in a portfolio. But the challenges were next to impossible. The liquidity in the market, the concentration. That's 2005. Now you look at the UAE, one of the most major markets in the world. In 2005, when everything looked so impossible, so hard. Today, it's a given. And Iraq, I don't think it can do it in 20 years. It'll probably take longer to grow the size of that market because you need relative stability. But having said that, cumulative positive effects can have something. So I mean, the market is tiny. It's actually shallow, but it's going the right place. How do I see the right place? So far, there is no real foreign interest in Iraq. People still see the media coverage, still see all the kind of stuff. If you ask me, I look at Iraqis. There are more and more Iraqis. Like I worked in financial reform. I worked in the team that worked on the economic transformation or changes in 2020. And I don't know at the time, Iraqi officials didn't know what the existence of a stock market. And I tell them, no, it exists right here, in Baghdad. Go down there, you'll find it. Most Iraqis didn't know. Now, Iraqis as general had discovered the market. So they're coming in and participating. But as I said to you, these things takes time. Go back earlier. What are people's savings most? They are physical assets, gold, property, physical dollars. To move into paper, that's a long-term process.
Do you think the involvement, I know a few months ago there was an agreement between, I think, stock exchange in Iraq and Abu Dhabi Securities Exchange. Do you think foreign knowledge and know-how can help propel the Iraqi stock exchange?
Well, it can, because look, we have some world-class companies. What people don't realize, for example, is we have a Pepsi bottler that has got the factory as one of the best and the largest in the Middle East, full stop. We do have that. So we do have world-class companies. Not many, granted, not many, very few. But the thing is, what the agreement, once it happens, what it does, the positive part of it is that if you are an investor in the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange, you deal through your local broker, you buy an Iraqi asset as if you're buying a UAE one, which means settlement, money transfer, all that stuff. You don't worry about it. That is a major opening for Iraq. Obviously, to make that happen, you have to do a lot of work like plumbing and so forth. But it shows you there is interest in Iraq and interest in, because no matter how many positive things I say, because I always end up by being biased, we are still a long way in our infrastructure, our human capacity issues, our physical systems. A lot of our stuff is an early process. So in working with something like the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange and opening up others, we benefit from their investments in the infrastructure. So if you can buy a share of this company through your local Abu Dhabi broker, and you transfer the money as if you're transferring it just like there, what prevents you from looking at it? Whereas if you have to do it in Iraq, you have to send your papers to Iraq, you got to get attestation, documentation, God knows how much paperwork you got to do. Most people say, can't be bothered. Same thing if you're an institution. People don't realize settlement and clearing, having the existence of custodians, all of it. It's much easier if you do them through your local, let's say Saudi or Abu Dhabi or Emirati or Qatari one. So these kind of promises are very much right. For me, the important part of them really is not only that, but it shows you that the region, our neighbors, other part of our neighbors are interested in the country.
Yeah, I think
we have neighbors more than all people think about this, more than Iran. We have more neighbors than just Iran. As important as that.
Absolutely. There was an article, I think, in a local Gulf newspaper this morning saying that a lot of Gulf investors are waiting to see what happens with the elections today, what it means. But Ahmed, I want to just, before we wrap up the podcast, because I've taken up a bit of time, there was one obviously thing that a lot of Iraqis have told me when I told them I was interviewing you was the IQD, the Iraqi Dinar, and de-dollarisation. I mean, to begin with the IQD, the central banks tried to do a lot to stabilize the dinar. How do you think it's been going so far with regards to stabilization?
Well, I answered it earlier. I mean, look, the Iraqi dinar, people misunderstanding. What we have is we have the official dinar, which we can get from the official dollar exchange. You can get if you are doing everything paperwork. So if you go to the banks and so forth, then you have the parallel market. The parallel market, I said to you earlier, pre-22 was 2% above that. Now it's about 10%. That, by the way, if you are let's say, an importer, or if you are an Iraqi traveling abroad, if you have your paperwork, you get the dollar at the official exchange rate. Not an issue at all. So people talk of dollar stable. Depending on what you're looking at. If you are somebody who's still using informality, still not using the system, then it's more and more difficult for you to access formal dollars. In the past, you can use the hawala structures to access them. Now you have to go access the parallel market. There's more demand in the parallel market than supply. Obviously, prices go up. I mean, that's the logic of markets. And then people say, oh, the stability. But if you are like me, like everybody else, as an Iraqi, you go to the airport, you take your boarding pass, you get your dollars and you leave. No issue. You get them at the official exchange rate. It is as stable as anything. So the instability, when people talk about, comes in from those accessing it informally. And in time, the more those who access informally decline, i.e. they become formal entities. Because, with formality, you have to pay taxes, you have stuff, all the things that you don't like to do in the Middle East, right? And if you go informality, then become formal, the cost of formality drop compared to the exchange rate difference, and therefore you'll see more and more. So as far as either way I look at it, dinar has been stable. If your paperwork is proper, then you have no issues. If you're informal, then you pay the premium, the 10% premium. Look, the central bank, there's nothing a central bank can do. Central bank can put the regulations in place, but it can't make you decide to become formal. Become formal, you pay taxes, you register, you have company history, you have all the stuff. You can be audited, you can be checked. All the stuff that goes in that is, iffy, or maybe let's say not so iffy, but let's say Middle Eastern practices. In a formal sector, you don't have. Same thing like you get workers coming in. Somebody fixes your house. If you end up by paying them in cash, they like that much more. If you pay them through your bank transfer, then he has to pay tax, all kind of these things. You can't blame the tax system for people who prefer to use cash. I don't blame them, but that's not the right way to go. So to end it in a way, no, the Iraqi dinar is stable if you've got the right infrastructure. It is stable. And I said to you, 89% of all transfers are taking place through the formal banking system, which is actually really promising.
With
one of the few good things we have.
Yeah, sorry. With Donald Trump being president since the beginning of this year, the volatility of the dollar and tariffs and all this fun stuff that's happening in financial markets, the big thing at the moment, or big thing that's been amplified by a lot of financial commentators, is de-dollarisation with the rise of BRICS and predominantly China and the Chinese-led system. Obviously, China is a major trading partner with Iraq. Do you think that, or is it possible at this point in time, or maybe in the near future, Iraq could become a member of BRICS? And if it does, do you think it could adopt the BRICS-led settlement system and payment system?
Look, again, I think there is a lot of romanticization and stuff on BRICS and alternative currencies and so forth. The issue people don't get is the medium of exchange and what you do with your surpluses. So the thing is, in most countries, let's say country A dealing with country B, if I export more to the country than I import from them, basically I have more of their currency. Where do I put my money? Where do you put that money? If you use a US banking system, the reason why the US banking system or the dollar is so dominant, not so much because of the conspiracy theory we have in the Middle East, but because ultimately you can buy US assets at will and you can sell them at will no matter what your size. So if you are any country, look at China, the absolute bulk of its foreign assets is still in dollars, because that's the only place whereby they can move billions and hundreds of billions in and out with no regulation, no structure, because the US market is fairly open and it's very liquid, it's very deep. I haven't read the details yet, but I remember, there's a lot of trade going between China and Russia in terms of, but still far from, I don't know, the figures, 20, 25, I read it a couple of years ago, so it must have increased, is in their currencies, because ultimately the yuan is not convertible when it comes to buying assets and so forth. So it's not convertible, it's called a capital account. If you're importing and exporting, it is convertible, but also subject to restrictions. But if you want to buy Chinese assets, for example, like you see the big major investors in China, what's called institutional investors, they have to have a foreign qualified investor number, and only then can they buy and sell. Whereas in the US, you can buy US treasuries, billions of them, right? And sell them or save them without any issue. And that's why it's there. So other currencies will have to, it's very difficult to replace the US market. Having said that, by the way, Donald Trump's antics since April begin to erode the things that made the US so attractive to almost everybody, i.e. the rule of law, if the courts are subject to political interference. Because in the olden days, you could have any conflict with anybody in the US and settle it through courts. And the courts are independent. If they become both sides, that's an issue. If the institutions become politicized. One of the reasons why we trust, because we have a confidence, not that they're perfect, by the way. Central bankers are far from perfect, don't get me wrong, but they make decisions separately. You have more confidence in that currency. So rule of law, all that kind of stuff. The reason why, I mean, you read today, by the way, in most thingies, and you get the dollar gets back its shine. The dollar has lost considerable, when you look at the dollar-weighted basket versus other currencies, lost a lot since April. Why? Because people began to lose confidence in the whole structure. But nobody can replace it. There is no currency that can replace it yet. Because what you look at is consistent currency, large markets, rule of law. The EU is wonderful, but the EU is one currency, but different fiscal systems. So you have that one there. Japan is amazing, but it's small. China, the issue with China comes in with how free are you in moving and selling Chinese assets? Because it's not only paying in yuan, it's actually what do you do when you're left with it? Can you buy assets and sell them just like this without interference? So ultimately, it goes to the US. But having all these changes in the US, I think at the margin, you'll begin to eat into that. And if you look, I don't know, 20, 25 years in future, we might have a multipolar world where everybody has to diversify. But so far, nothing emerged that can actually replace what the US has. But the US itself is actively eroding that confidence. That comes from arrogance as well.
I mean, Ahmed, just to you as an Iraqi, if you take the economist hat off for a second, do you feel or do you get the sense that most Iraqis support joining BRICS or joining a Chinese-led world order?
They might. I mean, the thing is, look, China for us is very important. It's our third largest trading partner. We import almost everything from China, just like everybody else does. The Chinese play a big factor in our economy. But I mean, if you ask the people I see, I find hardly anybody who's keen on thing. Everybody, if you ask Iraqis where they immigrate, or where they want to immigrate, nobody mentions they want to go to Peking. Everybody says they want to go to the US or Europe and so forth. So does that reflect preference from one over the other? No. But for Iraqis in general, we have to have good relations with everybody. So with us, China is a major country we deal with. Yeah, we need to understand it more. We need to work with them more. Same thing with every other trading partner.
As I mentioned at the top. As I mentioned at the top.
I don't know if it answered you or not, but
you did. As I mentioned at the top of the show, today is the election day in Iraq, and it's a very important election, and you've alluded to this. How do you feel the election will go? And whoever comes into office, however, Iraqi politics can be messy, as in most countries in the world. Yeah. What do you think the main priorities should be going into 2026 with regards to the economy for whoever takes power in Iraq?
Absolutely. Look, I mentioned to you earlier, one of the long-term challenges we have, the dependence on oil prices and a volatile asset that we have no control over. We are a rentier state. We have a high part of our economy driven by the state, and therefore driven by oil prices. What's called current expenditures, which with what we pay on the upkeep of the state, is rigid and inflexible and growing. And so when you have declines in oil prices, that affects us in a very negative way. We can't easily do the transformation that we need, i.e. introducing taxation, all the stuff that comes in with the requirement of balancing the budget. Because we have a rentier system, there's a lot of horrible stuff in it. I mean, I can spend hours talking what's wrong with our infrastructures. Just as you saw me waxing lyrical about the positive side, I can spend 10 times as much talking about the negative sides. But I think the priority for any upcoming government, whoever it is actually to look at the budget and work out a plan to minimize subsidies, because they need an enormous amount of the budget. We need to begin to induce more and more taxation to balance that, because we can't spend almost everything we earn on salaries and pensions and what have you, and nothing on infrastructure. And we have to grow our debt market, because I think we need to issue more and more debt to augment oil spending while we're going through a process. So what is needed is the same things that were discussed a few years ago and what's called the white paper in terms of economic transformation on the budget. Controlling rigid. I mean, if you read the IMF's report, it's exactly that. I think, if anything, by the way, the IMF was being sort of soft on Iraq. I think they should have been harder in terms of, because the risks are there, real. They could hurt us if we don't do the stuff down the line, if we don't work at cutting down the dependence on the budget for almost everything. So what comes to subsidies, whether that affects our our gas and oil, so power and electricity in the economy, our salaries, how we do taxation, our pensions, how we work, they are workable, but we need some sort of discipline. I see that discipline coming in from the bond markets. As we issue more debt, the bond markets will issue discipline. Just look at the reversal they forced on, the UK's, not this one, not the prior one, the hapless prime minister who had to resign in a few weeks after, the one who was compared to a cabbage for a while because the bond market revolted. Same thing, Trump's, the worst of the policies of April were reversed because the decline. So the bond markets can act as a regulator of government, the bad part of government spending or government decisions and so forth. And I think we as Iraq, we desperately need something like that. So we'll end up by doing more and more this. And that's where I see the challenges going ahead.
Ahmed, tell us any projects you're working on, any upcoming projects you're working on.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, working
any
on
publications or anything coming or anything?
Well, no, I mean, like, look, I mean, I've got a few bits and coming out in terms of writing. The fund is the number one priority. I continue to write on Iraq because it matters to me. It matters, I think, to anybody who look. And if anything I do that helps people look in Iraq in a realistic way, not positive, mind you. I'm not about positive and feel good factor, but realistic. You look at evidence and judge. That I continue to work on.
Anything?
Not really. I mean, I do have a LinkedIn account. I do have a Twitter account. I have, God help me, a Facebook one, but basically I use it mostly to publish my research. So if you look at me at LinkedIn, that's whatever I'm available there. Twitter, or I should be careful, it's called X, not Twitter anymore. I'm using less and less and less, but so whenever I can publish my work, whenever there's readership for it, I tend to be active. But on a personal level, hardly if anything. I'm still old school when it comes to personal stuff.
I'll link your LinkedIn profile and any kind of links you send to me after the show. But Ahmed Tabaqchali, this has been a really great conversation and a really eye-opener for a lot of people. And thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for that, by the way. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for because the thing is, I can bore people to death when I talk about Iraq.
It was great. It was great. Thank you.
My pleasure.